The billionaire's private jet sat quietly on the runway, its silver wings gleaming under the afternoon sun. It looked perfect from the outside, but inside something was wrong, terribly wrong. The engine had stopped working mid-flight, forcing an emergency landing at a small airfield far from any city. For a man like Richard Hale, one of the richest and most powerful businessmen in the country, this was more than an inconvenience. It was an insult. He stood near the jet, wearing an expensive suit, his hands clenched behind his back. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with frustration. The world knew him as a man who never accepted failure. His company built skyscrapers, bought entire corporations, and changed economies. But now, a single broken engine had made him feel powerless. Around him, his team of mechanics and engineers worked in silence, afraid to speak unless spoken to. One of them, a senior technician, wiped sweat from his forehead and said carefully, "Sir, we're doing our best. The problem seems to be deep in the central turbine system. It's complicated." Complicated? Richard's voice was sharp like a blade. "You're supposed to be the best." "I pay for the best." The man lowered his eyes. "We'll keep trying, sir." Hours passed. One expert after another examined the engine. Some brought digital scanners, others used manual tools. They argued, tested, and retested, but nothing worked. The more they touched it, the worse it seemed to get. The smell of fuel and metal filled the air. Sweat and fear mixed with the sound of failure. By evening, the sky turned orange and the airfield grew quiet. The billionaire's patience was wearing thin. His jet wasn't just transportation. It was a symbol of his power. Journalists had already caught the story. Billionaire's private jet grounded, engine failure stops takeoff. Cameras waited outside the gates, hungry for humiliation. Richard turned to his personal assistant, snapping, "Get me another team. I don't care what it costs. Fly them in tonight." "Yes, sir." The assistant replied quickly, dialing numbers with shaking hands. Nearby, a few locals gathered behind a fence, watching the chaos from a distance. The jet looked like a fallen giant, beautiful but helpless. Among the small crowd was a thin teenage girl wearing a torn gray hoodie. Her hair was messy, her shoes old, but her eyes were bright and curious. Her name was Amara. She had been wandering near the airfield, collecting small pieces of scrap metal to sell. When she saw the giant silver jet land earlier, her heart skipped a beat. It was the most beautiful machine she had ever seen. As she listened to the mechanics shouting and tools clattering, she moved closer, stopping just behind the fence. Amara loved machines. Ever since she was a little girl, she had been fascinated by engines, wires, and gears. When other children played with dolls, she took apart broken radios to see how they worked. She used to spend hours at the public library, reading old manuals about aircraft engines and science magazines that people threw away. But after her parents died in a house fire, she had no one left. Life on the streets had been cruel, but her love for machines never died. Now, standing near the fence, she could hear the experts arguing about fuel pressure, air intake, and electrical imbalance. She tilted her head slightly, listening to the sounds of the engine. To her, it wasn't just noise, it was a language. She could hear a strange rhythm in the silence of the machine, a pulse that didn't match what they were saying. "The problem isn't in the turbine," she whispered to herself. "It's the valve. The alignment is off." She knew she shouldn't speak. Nobody listened to a girl like her, homeless, dirty, and invisible. But still she stayed, her heart beating fast as she watched them fail over and over again. Inside the hangar, Richard had started pacing. His phone kept buzzing with calls from partners and journalists. "No comment," he kept saying coldly before hanging up. He hated the feeling of being trapped. He was used to controlling everything, but tonight, even his money couldn't control a stubborn engine. One of the engineers finally approached him and said softly, "Sir, maybe we need to send it back to the manufacturer. This might take days." "Days?" Richard turned to him sharply. "I have a meeting in Dubai in 16 hours. I don't have days." The engineer swallowed hard. "Then, I'm afraid there's nothing more we can do tonight." For the first time, silence filled the hangar. The billionaire stared at his jet, that proud symbol of luxury now grounded like a wounded bird. He felt anger rising inside him, but beneath it something else, a quiet helplessness he had not felt in years. Outside the fence, Amara watched him. She could see his anger, but also his pain. It was strange to feel sorry for a man who owned everything, She looked down at the rusty wrench in her pocket, her only tool, and whispered to herself again, "If he'd just let me see it, I could fix it." The wind blew gently across the airfield, carrying the faint sound of metal cooling as night approached. The mechanics packed their tools, murmuring in defeat. The billionaire stood alone beside his jet, the fading light reflecting off his expensive watch. He had everything money could buy except the one thing he needed most right now: a solution. Far behind him, hidden in the shadows, the girl who had nothing at all already held that solution in her mind. She didn't know it yet, but her life and his were about to change forever, and all it would take was 7 simple words. "If you allow, I can fix it." The night air was cool, and the soft hum of insects filled the silence around the airfield. The billionaire's jet stood still, its sleek body reflecting the dim lights like a sleeping giant. Everyone had gone except for 2 guards at the gate and a few mechanics finishing paperwork. But behind the tall chain-link fence hidden in the shadows, Amara was still there. She hadn't moved for hours. Her hands were tucked into the pockets of her old gray hoodie, and her tired eyes stared at the jet like it was calling to her. To her, that machine wasn't just metal, it was alive. Every hiss, every click, every faint sound of cooling pipes told a story. She could feel it deep inside her, as if the engine's silence was whispering, "Help me." Amara lived just a few blocks away, in a run-down shelter with flickering lights and thin blankets. Life had been harsh since she lost her parents in a house fire 3 years ago. She had tried to survive by cleaning dishes at diners and collecting scrap metal for cash, but whenever she passed near the airfield, she stopped and watched the planes. She didn't know why. Maybe because they reminded her of dreams that still refused to die. She remembered how her father used to call her, "my little engineer." He was a bus mechanic, and when she was small, he'd let her hold a wrench while he worked. He taught her that machines had feelings. "If you listen long enough," he once told her, "they'll tell you what's wrong." And now, standing by that fence, she could almost hear his voice again. Inside the hangar, a few workers were still talking. She listened carefully. "It's not the fuel line, I checked twice," one said. "The power grid's fine too," another replied, frustrated. "Maybe the turbine sensors are off." "No," Amara whispered softly. "It's not that either." She could tell from the way the jet had failed earlier it wasn't a sensor problem. It was mechanical, something tiny but crucial. She could hear the uneven balance in the engine's last breath before it shut down. Most people would never notice it, but she had spent her life noticing small things. Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since morning, but she stayed there, half hidden behind the fence post, watching the rich man's jet as if it were a friend who needed help. The wind picked up a little, blowing dust into her face. She wiped her cheek with the sleeve of her hoodie. The guards were too busy smoking to notice her. She could slip closer if she wanted. Her heart beat faster at the thought. She hesitated. She knew people like him, men in suits, men who looked at her and saw nothing. A homeless girl with dirt on her face and grease on her hands. To them, she didn't exist. But still, she couldn't walk away. For a long moment, she stared at the massive machine and whispered, "If you allow, I can fix it." The words escaped her like a secret. The next morning came with gray clouds and the sound of engines testing again. Amara was still nearby, her back aching from sleeping behind a dumpster. She washed her face at a small water tap near the hangar wall, then slipped her hands into her pockets and walked closer. Workers rushed around, shouting instructions. The billionaire had returned, looking more impatient than ever. "This is your last chance," Richard said coldly to the new team. "If this engine doesn't start, you're all fired." The engineers nodded nervously. One of them turned on the power system again. The engine made a heavy growl, sputtered, and died. Smoke rose from the exhaust. Richard cursed under his breath and slammed his fist on the railing. Amara watched from behind a crate, biting her lip. The sound confirmed what she had guessed last night. It wasn't electrical at all, it was a fuel misalignment, a small valve not closing properly. Something so simple yet so easy to miss. She took a deep breath. Her legs trembled, but she started walking toward the gate. The guard looked at her, frowning. "Hey, you can't be here," he said. She looked up at him, her voice calm but firm. "Please, I can help," the guard laughed.
"Help you?"
"Sweetheart, this isn't a bicycle. That's a billionaire's jet." "I know," she said quietly, "but if you allow, I can fix it." Something in her tone made the guard pause. She wasn't begging or pretending. She sounded like she knew. After a moment, he shrugged and said, "Go ahead, but don't say I didn't warn you." Amara walked slowly across the runway, her heart pounding. Everyone stopped to stare. The billionaire turned sharply when he saw her. "Who let this girl in?" he demanded. She stopped in front of him, her voice soft but steady. "Sir, I've been listening to your engine. I think I know what's wrong." The room fell silent. The engineers exchanged confused looks, trying not to laugh. Richard stared at her for a moment, his jaw tightening. "You think you know?" he said. "And who are you exactly?" "No one important," she said honestly. "But I can fix it, just if you allow me." Her words echoed across the hangar. No one spoke. For a second, Richard saw something in her eyes that made him hesitate. Not arrogance, not fear, but certainty. He sighed and gestured toward the jet. "You have 10 minutes, he said finally. "After that, I want you out of here." Amara nodded once. "That's all I'll need." And as she walked toward the great silver machine, every eye followed her. Some thought she was crazy. Some felt pity. But no one, not even Richard, expected what she was about to do next. Because sometimes miracles don't come wearing suits. Sometimes they come in a torn hoodie holding a rusted wrench. The hangar fell silent as Amara walked toward the giant jet. The soft sound of her footsteps echoed on the metal floor. Everyone stared, mechanics, engineers, guards, all frozen in disbelief. She looked completely out of place, wearing an old gray hoodie, torn jeans, and shoes that had seen too many rainy nights. Yet there was something calm about her, something steady in the way she carried herself. Richard Hale, the billionaire, crossed his arms and narrowed his eyes. He had seen all kinds of people, business geniuses, con artists, scientists, but never someone like her. "You have 10 minutes, he said again, his voice sharp, almost mocking. "After that, I want this nonsense over." Amara nodded, her face serious. She didn't respond with words. Instead, she walked straight toward the open engine bay. The smell of burnt oil and metal filled the air. The expensive tools lay scattered on the floor, abandoned after hours of failure. She crouched beside the engine, placed her hand gently on the metal casing, and closed her eyes for a moment. The mechanics watched, half amused. One whispered, "She's praying to it now." Another chuckled quietly. But when she opened her eyes, they weren't laughing anymore. Her eyes had changed, sharp, focused, almost glowing with thought. She picked up a wrench and slid under the jet, her movements quick but confident. It was like she had done this 1,000 times before. Her small hands touched each pipe, each bolt, listening through her fingertips. She wasn't guessing. She was searching for the machine's heartbeat. Richard watched with crossed arms, trying to convince himself this was pointless. But something in her silence made him uneasy. She wasn't acting. She was working. A few minutes passed. Everyone expected her to fail. But then she spoke without looking up. "You tighten this valve too much," she said softly. "It's choking the fuel flow. That's why your turbine's misfiring." The chief mechanic frowned. "Impossible." "We checked that 3 times, Amara didn't argue. She simply turned the wrench with a gentle twist, the metal groaning softly as it loosened. "Try it now," she said. The billionaire raised an eyebrow. "Are you serious?"
"Try it," she repeated.
Her voice wasn't begging. It was certain. One of the engineers sighed and pressed the ignition switch. The jet hummed, coughed, then, with a deep, smooth roar, the engine came alive. The sound filled the hangar, clean and strong, without a single sputter. The vibrations were perfect, balanced, alive. The mechanics froze. The same men who had spent 2 days trying to fix it now stood speechless. The billionaire's mouth fell slightly open, his disbelief plain. For the first time in hours, the air didn't smell like frustration. It smelled like victory. Amara slid out from under the jet, wiping her hands on her sleeve. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. "It just needed to breathe," she said quietly. "Machines get tired when people don't listen to them." No one spoke. The only sound was the steady purr of the jet engine, smooth as silk. The chief engineer broke the silence first. "How did you—" he began, his voice trembling. Amara looked at him and smiled faintly. "I read a lot. And I listen." Richard stepped forward, his expensive shoes echoing on the hangar floor. "Who taught you to do that?" he asked, his voice softer now. "My father," she said. "He used to fix buses. He said all engines have feelings. They just need someone who understands." He studied her for a long moment. She looked fragile, but there was strength in her posture, the kind that came from surviving things no one should have to. The mechanics and guards stared at her like she was some kind of miracle. The youngest engineer even clapped once before stopping himself. The billionaire didn't move. He just looked at her, trying to figure out how a homeless girl could do in minutes what trained experts couldn't in 2 days. Finally, he spoke again. "What's your name?" "Amara," she said simply. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes," she said. "You're the man who thought no one else could fix it." For a brief second, something like a smile appeared on his face. Then it vanished. "You just fixed a jet worth more than your entire city," he said. "Why should I believe this wasn't luck?" Amara shrugged. "You don't have to believe it," she said softly. "The engine already does." Her answer hit him like a wave. It wasn't arrogance, it was truth. Richard turned toward his team. "Shut it down," he said. The engine powered off with a hiss. Then he looked back at Amara. "Come to my office tomorrow. 10 a.m., don't be late." Amara blinked in surprise. "Why?" "Because I want to know," he said. "How a girl who has nothing just saved everything." As she walked away from the hangar, the night wind brushed through her hair. Behind her, the men whispered her name like it was a legend. The billionaire stood watching her go, his expression unreadable. He didn't know why, but deep down, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Respect, and maybe, just maybe, the start of something far greater than he could ever buy. The morning light slipped through the cracks of the hangar doors, spreading across the cold metal floor where the billionaire's jet stood, now alive, silent, and perfect. Everyone had gone home after the miracle last night, but one man hadn't slept at all. Richard Hale sat in his limousine outside the airfield, replaying the scene over and over in his mind, the sound of the engine roaring back to life, the look on the girl's face, and those 7 simple words. "If you allow, I can fix it." He couldn't forget them. When he looked into her eyes, he hadn't seen arrogance or fear. He'd seen something that scared him more, certainty. That kind of confidence didn't come from luck. It came from knowing. Meanwhile, Amara woke up in the shelter, the smell of dust and stale bread filling the small room. Her old blanket barely covered her and her stomach ached from hunger, but she smiled anyway. She had done it. She had fixed a billionaire's jet. The thought felt unreal, like a dream she wasn't supposed to have. She splashed cold water on her face from the broken tap, tied her messy hair back, and looked at herself in the cracked mirror. "You did good," she whispered softly. "But don't start dreaming too big." Still, her heart felt light. For once, she wasn't invisible. Someone powerful had seen her, even if just for a moment. At the airfield, Richard was giving orders to his assistant. "Find out who that girl is," he said. "Her name's Amara. She said she's from around here." The assistant looked surprised. "Sir, you want me to find a homeless girl?" "Yes," Richard snapped. "And stop asking stupid questions." By mid-morning, Amara arrived at the airfield again, clutching her small rusted toolbox. She didn't expect anyone to notice her, but the guards recognized her immediately. One of them smiled awkwardly. "Hey, the miracle girl's back." Inside the hangar, the billionaire was already waiting. He stood beside the jet, his expression unreadable. When he saw her, he nodded slightly. "You came." "You asked me to," she said. "I didn't think you would." "I said I would," she replied simply. For the first time in years, Richard didn't know what to say. He was used to people who talked too much, who tried to impress him. But this girl, she said only what needed to be said. Nothing more. He gestured toward the engine. "Explain it to me," he said. "How did you know what was wrong?" Amara looked at the machine, then at him. "You were all looking at the big picture," she said softly. "The turbine, the sensors, the system. But the problem was small, hidden. A valve that was misaligned. It was crying, but nobody was listening." "Crying?" he repeated. She smiled faintly. "Machines cry differently, sir. Not with tears and with sound." For a long second, Richard said nothing. He had met engineers with degrees from the best universities, scientists with 10 titles after their names, but never anyone who spoke about machines like they were alive. He asked quietly, "Who taught you to listen like that?" "My father," she said. "He used to fix buses. He said everything, people, engines, even hearts, and they'll break the same way. If you care enough to listen, you can fix anything." Richard turned away, pretending to inspect the plane. Her words hit him deeper than he wanted to admit. He finally said, "Do you know that the men who failed to fix this jet were some of the best-paid engineers in the world?" Amara shrugged. Maybe they stopped learning when they started earning. He looked back at her sharply and then surprisingly smiled. A small, genuine smile. "You're bold." "No, sir," she said quietly. "I'm just honest." A few of the staff members nearby exchanged shocked glances. No one ever spoke to Richard Hale like that. But instead of anger, he felt something else, admiration. He motioned toward his desk. "Come here." On the table lay a sleek black card with golden letters, Hale Dynamics Aerospace Division. He slid it toward her. "This is my company," he said. "We build engines, better ones than this." "I want you to come see it." Amara's eyes widened. "Why me?" "Because you fixed what others couldn't," he said. "And because I don't believe in accidents." She stared at the card like it was a doorway to another world. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. I don't have anything," she said softly. "No school, no diploma, no home." Richard's voice softened. "Then start with this." For the first time she smiled fully, a real warm smile that lit her entire face. "I'll think about it," she said. "Don't think too long," he replied. "Opportunity doesn't wait forever." As she walked out of the hangar, the sun hit her face and the wind carried the faint scent of fuel and freedom. She looked at the card again, her reflection shining faintly on its black surface. It was the first thing in her life that had her believing she could still build the future she once dreamed of. Behind her, Richard watched through the window, still wondering who she really was, and how a girl who slept on the streets had just taught him the simplest, most powerful truth: genius doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears rags and carries a rusted wrench. The next morning, the airfield was buzzing with whispers. Mechanics, pilots, and technicians all talked about the girl, the homeless one. The one who fixed the billionaire's jet when no one else could. Some called it luck. Others called it a miracle. But those who had seen her work, those who heard that engine come alive, knew it was something else entirely. When Richard Hale arrived that morning, the air itself seemed heavier. Reporters had started to gather outside the gates, hoping for a comment. "Is it true?" they shouted. "Did a homeless girl really repair your jet?" Richard ignored them. His thoughts were still caught between disbelief and curiosity. He had seen the proof with his own eyes. A girl in torn clothes solving a puzzle that the world's best minds couldn't. Yet a part of him still struggled to accept it. How could someone with nothing know something no one else did? Inside the hangar, his lead engineer approached him nervously. "Sir," he began, "we rechecked everything she touched. The valve alignment, the hose connection, all perfect. We ran 3 full diagnostics. It's flawless." Richard looked up sharply. "So it wasn't a fluke?" The engineer shook his head slowly. "No, sir. She really knew what she was doing." For a moment, Richard said nothing. Then he let out a quiet breath and whispered, "Unbelievable." Meanwhile, Amara sat on the curb outside the shelter, eating a piece of dry bread. Her fingers were still stained with grease from the night before. She didn't care. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the jet's engine humming, strong and perfect, like a song she had written. She didn't know her story had already begun spreading. A local mechanic had filmed part of her fixing the jet and posted it online. Within hours, the video exploded across social media. "Homeless black girl fixes billionaire's jet after experts fail." Millions watched. Some called her a genius. Others called her a liar. But everyone was talking about her. At the airfield, Richard's assistant walked in, holding a phone. "Sir, you need to see this." He showed Richard the video. The billionaire watched silently as the clip played, Amara's calm voice saying, "Try it now." Then, the powerful roar of the engine. The camera caught the disbelief on every face, even Richard's. The video ended and the hangar fell silent. "She's everywhere, sir," the assistant said. "News channels want interviews. People are calling her the girl who listened to the sky." Richard rubbed his chin, lost in thought. He didn't like attention, especially not this kind. But this was different. It wasn't just about a jet anymore. It was about something far greater. A story the world hadn't heard in a long time. A nobody doing the impossible. Later that afternoon, a black car stopped near the shelter. The door opened and Richard Hale stepped out, his polished shoes touching the cracked pavement. People on the street froze. A billionaire's car didn't belong in this part of town. Amara was sitting by the wall, fixing a broken radio she had found in the trash. She looked up in surprise. "You came here?" Richard nodded. "You weren't answering your phone." "My assistant said you don't have one." She smiled faintly. "Phones are expensive. Radios are easier to fix." He chuckled softly, something he rarely did. "You're famous, you know. The whole world's talking about you." Her eyes widened. "Famous?" He nodded. "They've given you a nickname, the Sky Listener." Amara blinked, unsure how to feel. She looked down at her hands, rough and tired. "I didn't do it for fame," she said quietly. "I just wanted to help." "I know," Richard said. "That's why people believe it." He took a deep breath. "You humbled me, Amara. I've spent my life surrounded by experts, and not one of them taught me what you did in 10 minutes. She tilted her head slightly. "What did I teach you?" He smiled. "That knowledge without heart is useless. That genius can come from anywhere, even from behind a fence." For a moment, they just looked at each other. Two people from different worlds connected by one act of courage. Around them, the city noise faded. Then Richard said quietly, "I want you to come work for me. Not as a story or a headline, but as an engineer." Amara's eyes filled with disbelief. "Me? Work for you?" He nodded. "You've already done what my top engineers couldn't. You've earned more than a chance. Yeah, you've earned a place." Her hands trembled slightly. "I don't even have a degree." "Then we'll get you one," he said. "I'll make sure of it." For the first time, Amara couldn't find words. She looked at the ground, fighting the lump in her throat. "Why are you doing this?" Richard looked at her, really looked at her. "Because you fixed more than my jet," he said softly. "You fixed something in me." The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of a distant engine. She smiled through tears, and for a moment, the world felt still. Neither of them knew that this was just the beginning, that a girl once invisible to the world would soon rise to change it. And it all began with one broken engine. And one man who finally decided to listen. That night, the world didn't sleep. News channels across the country ran the same story, a homeless black girl who had done what no trained engineer could. Her photo, taken when she wiped her hands on her torn hoodie after fixing the billionaire's jet, was everywhere. Some called her a prodigy. Others called her a miracle. But to Amara, none of that felt real. She sat by the shelter window, the dim streetlight flickering outside. In her hand, she held a printed newspaper someone had given her. Her name, Amara Daniels, was written in bold letters across the front page. Beneath it, a headline read, "The Girl Who Fixed the Sky." She stared at it quietly, unsure whether to laugh or cry. For years, she had been invisible. People looked past her on the street, ignored her when she begged for food. Now suddenly, everyone wanted to know her story. But what story was there to tell? Just a girl who lost everything, except her love for machines. When dawn broke, a black car waited outside the shelter again. It was Richard Hale's. His assistant stepped out, smiling nervously. "Mr. Hale would like to take you somewhere," he said politely. Amara hesitated. "Where?" The assistant's smile softened. "Home." Minutes later, she sat in the back seat of the luxurious car, staring out the window as the city passed by. The tall buildings reflected sunlight, and for the first time, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. Richard sat beside her, silent for most of the ride. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't bring you here for cameras or interviews," he said quietly. "I want to know your story." Amara looked down, her hands twisting together. "There's not much to tell." "Tell it anyway," he said. She took a deep breath. "I was 10 when my parents died. A fire started in our apartment. My dad tried to save my mom, but they both..." Her voice broke. She paused, staring out the window. "After that, no relatives wanted me. I bounced between shelters, sleeping in places no one would care to look. But I always had machines. They were the only things that made sense." Richard listened silently. "My dad was a mechanic," she continued. "He taught me everything before he died. How to listen to the rhythm of an engine, how to feel for broken parts. He used to say, 'You don't fix machines, Amara, you heal them.'" She smiled faintly at the memory. "I guess that's what I did for your jet." The car grew quiet. Richard's gaze softened. He saw now what her eyes had been hiding. loss, loneliness, and strength far beyond her years. When they reached his mansion, Amara froze. The house was massive, glass walls, shining floors, and art worth more than she could imagine. She stood at the doorway, afraid to step inside. Richard noticed. "Don't worry," he said. "It's just walls. What's inside them only matters if there's heart." He led her into his study, filled with blueprints, models of jets, and half-built engine designs. "My father built this company from nothing," he said. "He used to tell me that no one is truly self-made. We all stand on someone's shoulders. Maybe it's time I start offering mine to someone else." Amara looked around, eyes wide. "You live inside your machines," she said softly. Richard smiled. "And you understand them like no one I've ever met." He handed her a photo frame from his desk, an old picture of him as a child beside a rusted engine. "When I was your age," he said, "I believed I'd build the best machines in the world. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what they were meant to do, to move people, to connect lives." He glanced at her. "You reminded me." Tears filled Amara's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. She didn't want him to see her cry. Richard gestured toward the workshop below. "That's where the next engine is being built. I'd like you to see it." They walked down to the lab, where rows of scientists in white coats stopped what they were doing to stare. Whispers rippled through the room. "That's her. The girl from the news." Amara pretended not to hear them. Her eyes were drawn to the massive prototype sitting in the center, sleek, silver, and incomplete. She stepped closer, running her hand lightly along its surface. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Richard folded his arms. "It's called the Halo X engine. It's supposed to revolutionize air travel. But it's been stuck for months. Every test fails." She crouched beside the machine, her fingers tracing a narrow seam near the base. Her brow furrowed. "It's breathing wrong," she said. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Breathing?" Amara nodded. "Engines breathe like lungs. Too much air here." She tapped the casing. "And it loses pressure here." She looked up at him. "You designed this part, didn't you?" He blinked in surprise. "Yes, how did you—" "Because it sounds like you," she said softly. "Precise, but a little too proud." He laughed, really laughed this time. "You just called me proud?" She smiled. "Only a little." That afternoon they worked together, billionaire and homeless girl side by side, adjusting parts and testing theories. It was strange, yet natural. For the first time, Richard wasn't the smartest person in the room. And for the first time, Amara wasn't invisible. By evening, the new engine started. Not perfectly, but close. The sound filled the lab, rich and alive. The engineers clapped. Richard turned to her, eyes glowing with pride. "You're incredible," he said. She shook her head. "No. I just listened." And in that moment, Richard Hale, a man who had built an empire on money and machines, realized that this girl, who had slept on concrete floors and dreamed of engines, had something he never did, a heart that truly understood creation. She didn't just mend engines, she mended people. That night, the lights in the Hale Dynamics laboratory glowed long after everyone else had gone home. The air still carried the faint warmth of the newly revived engine, the one Amara and Richard had brought back to life together. It wasn't just a machine that had been fixed. Something far deeper had changed. Something inside both of them. Amara stood by the giant window overlooking the city. For the first time in her life, she was standing somewhere she never thought. She belonged, inside a place where geniuses worked, where people wore white coats and spoke in equations. Yet she felt strangely at peace, as if this had always been her world, just waiting for her to arrive. Down below, Richard watched her from across the lab floor. He saw a girl who had come from the streets, barefoot and hungry, now glowing in the soft blue light of his machines. There was a quiet power in her, the kind that didn't demand attention but commanded it anyway. He walked up beside her. "You didn't just help me today," he said softly. You reminded me why I started all this. Amara looked at him. To build machines? He shook his head. To build hope. They stood in silence for a moment, the city lights twinkling below like fallen stars. Then Richard took a small envelope from his jacket and held it out to her. I was waiting for the right time, he said. I think this is it. Amara frowned slightly and took the envelope. Inside was a letter printed on thick cream-colored paper. At the top, it read, Full scholarship offer, Hale Dynamics Engineering Program. She froze. Her eyes scanned the words again and again, as if she couldn't believe they were real. The scholarship was not just for study. It was for housing, books, food, and a guaranteed position at the company upon graduation. I don't, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't understand. Richard smiled gently. You said once that no one ever gave you a chance. I want to change that. Tears gathered in her eyes. Why me? Because the world needs people who listen, he said simply. You listened when everyone else talked. You saw what others missed. I don't just see an engineer in you, Amara. I see the future. She looked at him, her lips parting but no words coming out. Her throat tightened. For so long, life had given her nothing but silence and cold nights. And now, this. A chance. A real one. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. I don't know what to say. Say yes, he said. Her tears finally fell, but she smiled through them. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times yes. Richard's smile widened, and for the first time in years he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Joy without pride. Good, he said. Then it settled. As they walked toward the exit, flashes from cameras appeared outside the glass doors. Reporters again. Word had spread that the billionaire and the girl were working together. But this time, Richard didn't tell security to chase them away. He paused beside Amara and said, Let them see. Let them see what real talent looks like. She looked at him nervously. They'll ask questions. Then answer them, he said. Tell them the truth, that a girl who had nothing gave everything she had, and changed everything. The doors opened and the night air rushed in, cool and full of city sounds. The reporters called her name, microphones flashing like lightning. Amara, how did you fix the jet? What's it like working with Richard Hale? Did he really offer you a scholarship? Amara took a deep breath, looked at Richard, and then faced the cameras. Her voice was calm, sure, and full of something pure. It wasn't about the jet, she said. It was about listening. When no one listens, to machines, to people, things break. I just listened. For a second, even the crowd went silent. Her words weren't rehearsed, weren't polished, but they struck straight to the heart. Richard stepped beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. And that, he said proudly, is why she's the best engineer I've ever met. The flashlights exploded around them. Somewhere behind the noise, a child watching on a cracked TV screen in another shelter whispered, I want to be like her. That night, social media burned with her story again. But this time, it wasn't just about a miracle. It was about hope. A girl who once had nothing now stood beside one of the richest men in the world, not as a charity case, but as an equal. And while the world saw a headline, Richard saw something else entirely. The future of human brilliance. As the car drove her back to the shelter for one last night, Amara looked out the window at the glowing skyline and whispered to herself, Dad, I did it. Someone finally listened. Tomorrow, her new life would begin. A life built not from money but from courage, in a single sentence that changed everything. If you allow, I can fix it.